The bass rolled through the floor like distant thunder, a heavy pulse that seemed to shake the night itself. Sharp flashes of light sliced through the darkness, flickering in quick, bladed bursts. Nathan Callahan sat back in his private VIP corner, slowly turning the glass of whiskey in his hand, only a few more seconds before he would signal his guards to leave because the night ahead felt dull and empty to him. But then he saw her. In the center of the crowded dance floor, beneath the shifting glow of red and gold, she moved with a rhythm that did not belong to the chaos around her. At first, she was just another woman in the club. Then she turned her head, and his entire world seemed to stop. Grace Morgan, his housemaid. But the woman dancing out there was nothing like the quiet girl who carried tea trays or polished the glossy wooden floors each morning. This was someone entirely different. Someone radiant. Someone who moved as if no eyes in the world were on her. Someone he had never truly seen until tonight. Nathan remained still, one arm resting against the black leather seat, his gaze locked on the swirl of light and the woman at its center. Her metallic red dress clung to every soft curve of her body, catching the light like fire each time she shifted her hips. Her long, toned legs revealed beneath the short hem that brushed only to mid-thigh. Her dark brown hair, usually tied neatly at the back with a plain black band, now spilled loose around her shoulders, lifting and falling with each movement, reflecting the lights like strands of burning silk. Her eyes were closed. The smile on her lips was nothing like the polite smile he had seen in the kitchen whenever someone made a joke. This smile was real, warm, unhidden. She tilted her head back slightly, letting the music fill her, turning in a natural rhythm that carried no intention of drawing attention. She was not dancing for anyone. She was dancing for herself. Nathan did not answer, did not react, did not blink. Only her name echoed in his mind. Grace Morgan. She had worked in his home for nearly half a year. He knew her as the perfect employee, quiet, punctual, modest, always careful to avoid trouble. Every day she wore the same uniform, black flats, eyes lowered whenever she passed him in the hallway. He had never really seen her. Not like this. Not as she truly was. The woman on that floor, swallowed in music and light, was a secret he had never been allowed to witness. A hidden part of her soul he never imagined existed right there inside his house, right in front of him, all this time. The people beside him kept talking, their laughter mingling with the music, but he heard none of it. Everything seemed to compress into silence until only she remained, moving and alive and burning in the dark. His heart skipped a beat. He felt it, that quiet yet powerful shift inside him. Something strange and unmistakably real rising in his chest, and he knew in that single moment that nothing would ever be the same again. If you have stayed with the story until this moment and felt your heart tremble just a little with what has unfolded, please remember to subscribe, tap the heart, or share this video with someone who also cherishes the kind of moments that quietly touch the soul. We tell stories every day, gentle and unhurried, yet they linger long after the last word fades. Where are you listening from? Leave the name of your city or state in the comments below so we can see how far this story has traveled across the map of America, or even beyond. And who knows, perhaps you might become the main character of the next story we tell. Grace turned with the music, her loose hair brushing over her shoulders, the flashing red and gold lights making her look like the center of the entire universe. And then, in one sudden moment, she opened her eyes. Nathan was still there, standing near the edge of the dance floor where the light barely reached half his face. She saw him. Her entire body froze, her step unfinished. The turn broken in the middle. The smile vanished from her lips, replaced by a swirl of emotions: confusion, shock, something close to fear. She could not form a single word, standing motionless in the crowd, her hand still holding the wrist of the friend she had been dancing with. Her breath hitched, her eyes wide as though she was trying to understand whether she was dreaming. Nathan did not move. But the way he looked at her was no longer the gaze of a man seeing an employee. It was deeper, quieter, as if he was trying to hold this moment in his memory. Every line of it, every emotion of it. Grace blinked twice, then mouthed the words without a sound. Mr. Callahan. She did not know whether he could read her lips, but something in his expression softened, though his eyes never left hers. Nathan stepped forward, closing the space between them to only a few strides. Instinct made Grace pull back half a step, her hand tugging at the hem of her dress as if she could hide the curves he had just seen. She felt stripped bare, not because of the dress, but because of the gaze of a man who had barely acknowledged her for 6 long months and was now looking straight into the center of her being. Nathan stopped when he was less than 2 meters from her. The music still pounded, the dance floor still pulsed with movement, yet between them stretched a small, invisible space, tense and quiet enough to steal the air from her lungs. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his head just enough for his voice to rise above the deep roll of the bass. His voice was low, steady, meant only for her. Grace. She trembled when he spoke her name. Not the girl who cleans, not the maid, but her real name, for the first time. "You don't have to be afraid," he continued, his eyes never wavering. "You haven't done anything wrong." Grace parted her lips to speak, but her throat tightened. All her life she had tried to be small, invisible behind the safe shell of a uniform and silence. Yet now, the one man she had always tried to avoid drawing attention from was seeing her, truly seeing her. I didn't know you would be here tonight," she finally whispered, her voice thin with nerves. "I only came with my friends. I just wanted to let myself breathe a little." Nathan nodded slowly, as though he understood. "This is one of the clubs I own," he answered. "I come often, but I rarely stay long. Until tonight." Grace swallowed hard, her hands unsure where to rest, her eyes unsure where to look. She had never prepared for this. No one prepares for their Mafia boss standing in the middle of a nightclub staring at them while they are wearing a dress that sparkles like a sky full of stars. One of her friends stepped closer, a hand on her shoulder, shouting over the music, "What's going on?" Grace did not answer. Her gaze remained locked on Nathan. He stepped in just half a pace more, close enough for her to catch the faint warmth of wood and musk rising from his shirt. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice soft as air yet impossibly firm. Grace glanced at her friend, then nodded, the movement so tiny it was almost invisible. Nathan lifted a hand, not touching her, only gesturing for her to follow. She hesitated for a single heartbeat, then pressed a hand to the side of her dress, drew in a deep breath, and left the dance floor with the man she had never imagined would ever look in her direction. As she walked through the crowd, her heart pounded as if it might break free from her chest, and in the chaos of the music and lights, lost among hundreds of shifting glances, there was only one gaze that made her feel both exposed and seen, and she had no idea whether it made her want to run away or stay exactly where she was. The next morning, a pale strand of sunlight slipped through the thick curtains of the Callahan estate, weaving itself into the seams of the wooden walls and laying a velvet-like glow across the dark brown floor. The house was unusually quiet, broken only by the slow, steady ticking of the hallway clock. Grace walked softly down the stairs as she did every morning, a basket of clean linens in her arms, her hair pinned neatly at the back of her neck, her neutral gray uniform fitting so unobtrusively that she seemed to fade into the backdrop of the home. Everything felt familiar, the silence, the order, the safety, yet her heart did not match it. She could still feel the echo of the previous night thrumming faintly inside her, like the lingering end of a song that refused to fade completely, and she wondered whether any of it had been real, whether that gaze, that voice, that steady gentleness from Nathan had been nothing more than a fleeting illusion born in the dark. She stepped into the kitchen, the wide room with its white walls, cool tiles, and the first hints of coffee drifting from the automatic machine. She set the basket on the counter, picked up a cloth, and began wiping the marble surface out of habit. But then came a sound from the doorway, soft, slow, purposeful. Grace lifted her head and her heart stopped. Nathan Callahan stood in the kitchen entrance. He never came in at this hour. Breakfast was always brought to him. The kitchen belonged to the staff, to her. But this morning, he was here. No jacket, no guards, no distance. Just Nathan, in a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled, his hair still damp as though he had only just stepped out of the shower. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. She quickly set the cloth aside, trying to steady her breath. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice so soft she could barely hear it herself. Nathan stepped farther into the room, his eyes following every small movement she made, as if they had suddenly become meaningful. "Do you mind if I get my own coffee?" he asked. And before she could answer, he had already moved toward the machine, finding his preferred cup, the white porcelain one with the thin gold rim that she always washed separately and placed on the highest shelf. She nodded, stepping back slightly, still unsure this was truly happening. He added sugar, a bit of milk, stirred, then turned to lean against the counter, looking at her over the rising steam. "Grace," he said again, his voice low and warm. "About last night." She turned away, her hand curling around the edge of her apron. "Last night was nothing, sir. I shouldn't have been there." "But you were," he said, not harshly, simply stating a fact. "And I saw you. For the first time." Grace closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them and met his gaze, not looking away this time. "I just wanted one night to be myself," she said quietly but firmly. "Not the girl who scrubs floors. Not someone no one remembers." Nathan set the cup down and stepped closer. "I'm sorry if I ever made you feel unseen, but I am looking, Grace. Since last night, I haven't stopped." Her fingers tightened, but she did not back away. They stood barely a breath apart. Nathan paused, his eyes locked with hers, holding no curiosity of a man discovering something new, but the reverence of someone realizing he had been holding something precious without knowing it. She had no words, none felt right or safe, and he did not ask for any. He only nodded, picked up his cup, and left through the same door he had entered. When it closed gently behind him, Grace realized her hands were trembling, yet something small inside her had shifted. She was not invisible anymore, not to him, not anymore. That afternoon, the sky turned the color of soft ash, a thin veil draped over the city, and in the quiet mansion on the hill, time seemed to move with the same muted weight. Grace was dusting the upstairs hallway when she heard footsteps behind her, steady, familiar, unmistakable. She did not have to turn to know who it was. Every step he took carried its own rhythm, heavy, slow, deliberate. Nathan stopped beside her, keeping just enough distance not to crowd her, yet close enough that he did not need to raise his voice. "May I offer you a cup of tea?" The simple question felt like the world shifting ever so slightly off its old axis. Grace turned to him, surprised, then nodded. "Yes, if you wish." No guards, no staff. Just the two of them in the small sitting room facing the back garden where lavender bushes swayed softly in the wind. Grace sat at the edge of the chair, back straight, hands resting neatly on her lap. Nathan sat across from her, turning the cup of tea he had brewed himself, something she had never witnessed. "Grace," he said after a quiet moment, "thank you for agreeing to sit with me today." She gave a small, uncertain smile. "I know everything happened unexpectedly," he continued. "For me, and even more for you, I imagine." She nodded. "I'm still not used to my employer wanting to have tea with me." Nathan gave a soft laugh, low and warm. "And I'm not used to my housemaid appearing like a star in the middle of a nightclub I own." They both laughed quietly, then fell into a silence that no longer felt awkward, but like a fragile bridge stretching between two distant worlds. Nathan set his cup down and met her eyes. "I've been thinking a lot since last night, about how I see people, about how I never really saw you all this time." Grace swallowed, her throat tight. "I never wanted to be seen," she said softly. "I just wanted to do my job well, stay safe. Keeping to the shadows was the only way I knew how." He tilted his head. "Why?" She stayed silent for a long time before finally answering, her gaze fixed on the garden beyond the window. "Because I learned that when you start being noticed, trouble usually follows. In the world I grew up in, girls who stand out don't stay safe for long." Nathan stilled, hearing the quiet exhaustion beneath her words, the shape of a guarded past. "I don't know anything about you, Grace," he said gently. "But I'd like to, if you'll let me." She looked back at him, no longer hiding. "And if you did know, would you see me differently?" "I don't know," Nathan admitted without pretense or polish. "But I would at least be looking with open eyes, not closed ones." She held his gaze, and in that moment something softened inside her, a thin fracture allowing the first thread of light to slip through. "I used to live in Portland," she began, her voice steady as though reciting a long-kept truth. "My mother died early. My father left. I lived with an aunt who did not want me there. When I was 16, I left. When I was 18, I worked in a bar. Then I met a man who made me believe I was loved. But he controlled everything. My clothes, my friends, my phone, my thoughts." Nathan's hand tightened, the veins along his knuckles rising. She didn't see it, her eyes fixed on the memories she had just uncovered. "It took me almost 3 years to leave him, and 2 more years before I stopped being afraid of footsteps behind me." She met his gaze again, steady and quiet, without pleading or bitterness. "So I chose silence. I chose smallness. And I was safe. Until you saw me last night." Nathan exhaled, the sound heavy with everything she had carried alone. He stood, took one slow step toward her, but did not touch her. "I'm sorry," he said softly, "for ever letting you become invisible in a house that belonged as much to you as to me. But since last night, I've begun to learn how to see, and I don't want to stop." Grace did not answer right away. She only looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod, a quiet nod, but carrying the weight of a beginning. From the days that followed their conversation, something between them began to shift, not loudly, not hurriedly, but as clearly as sunlight slipping through the leaves each morning. Grace continued her usual work, tidying rooms, checking linens, changing the water in flower vases, and preparing breakfast right on time. Yet her eyes no longer darted away whenever she passed Nathan in the hallway. She no longer bowed her head or rushed by as though afraid someone might notice she existed. Instead, every now and then she would look up, catch his gaze from the far end of the corridor, and a quiet nod from him was enough to send her heartbeat stumbling. Nathan, for his part, was no longer the distant employer who only appeared at meetings or late-night gatherings. He walked in the garden more often, sat on the long bench facing the kitchen while she washed the glasses, and on some days even asked what kind of flowers she liked so he could plant them on the balcony. Small questions, simple moments, ones that had never existed before. And each time he asked, Grace felt as though someone was inviting her to step out of a shell she had worn for so long, she had nearly forgotten how to remove it. One early weekday morning, while arranging white roses in a crystal vase on the dining table, she noticed an additional small vase beside it, filled with pale lavender, her favorite flower. No one in the house knew that. No one had ever asked, and she had never spoken of it. Grace stood there for a long time, her fingers brushing the tiny petals, her heart trembling softly like water touched by the lightest breeze. Later that afternoon, when Nathan entered the house and handed his coat to a guard, he paused as he passed the dining room and met her eyes. "You saw the flowers, didn't you?" he asked, his voice warm with a hint of something quietly hopeful. She nodded with a small smile. "Thank you," she said, using that word for the first time, and when the word "you" slipped from her lips, she saw something in Nathan's expression pause, soften, then deepen. "I thought you might like them," he replied gently, before walking away and leaving behind a warmth that lingered in the room long after he had gone. Sometimes, in the late afternoons, when the sun cast a golden glow across the stone steps in the garden, Grace would find Nathan standing there with a glass of wine, or simply observing the sway of the branches. The first time, she gathered all her courage to bring him a cup of tea, not out of duty, but because she wanted to. He accepted it, and their hands brushed lightly, warm and unexpected, and neither of them said a word as the breeze and a quiet sweetness stretched softly between them. Once, when she cut her hand on a broken glass in the kitchen, Nathan was the first to appear, his eyes wide with alarm as he took her hand as though she had suffered a grave injury. "Does it hurt?" he asked, his voice roughened with concern. Grace gave a faint laugh. "It's only a scratch." But he still held her hand, gently cupping it, his gaze fixed on the small drop of blood soaking into the cloth. "I don't like seeing you hurt, not even a little," he said, as if making a vow. These changes would mean nothing to an outsider, but to Grace, they felt like a whole world slowly opening. She began to feel as though she held a real place in this house, no longer someone who appeared and vanished with each shift. And the thing that frightened her most was not his gaze, but the way she found herself waiting for it. Each time she heard his footsteps, each time she felt his eyes on her in what should have been an ordinary moment, her heart trembled not with fear, but with hope. And that, she knew, was the most dangerous part. Because for someone who had spent her life trying not to be seen, being seen truly could either break her or bring her back to life. And with Nathan, his gaze no longer belonged to an employer watching an employee, but to a man beginning to recognize something he could no longer ignore. That morning, the sky was covered in a thin layer of silver gray, neither rain nor sun, only a quiet light settling over the stone walls of the Callahan estate. Grace walked down the stairs as she always did, carrying a tray of fresh towels and a small notebook of tasks, but her mood was lighter, softened by the lingering warmth of the day before when Nathan had left a carefully prepared cup of tea on the table for her, along with a small handwritten note that said, "For a gentler afternoon." His handwriting was slanted and strong, but what made her heart flutter was not the ink, but the quiet care behind it, the kind of attention meant for her and only her. She no longer felt like a shadow in this house. She was beginning to be seen, beginning to be reached. She walked toward the back service entrance to collect the morning mail as she did every day. But today, something felt different. As she reached for the handle, she froze. Tucked tightly into the frame of the screen door was a small folded note. At first, she assumed it was a laundry slip blown there by the draft, but when she picked it up and opened it, her heart tightened as if gripped by an invisible hand. The handwriting was crooked, scribbled in black ink, short, without punctuation, without a name, without an explanation. Only 3 words: behave yourself. Her hand trembled. She glanced down the empty hallway, seeing no one, hearing nothing out of place. And it was that very silence that made her shiver. Someone had been here. Someone knew she was here. Someone was watching. Grace stepped into her room, locked the door behind her, and sat on the edge of her bed, still holding the note as though afraid it would disappear if she let go. She read the words again and again, the fifth, the sixth time, yet they never changed. They remained simple, cold, and threatening. Old memories surged back at once, watchful eyes, late-night phone calls, doors left unlocked and found ajar in the quiet. She had thought she escaped. She had thought she erased her trail. And yet, someone had found her. She folded the note tightly and hid it in the bottom drawer of the dresser where she kept the few personal belongings she owned. She didn't want Nathan to know. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she didn't want to drag him into her shadows. Her world had once been a silent wound, and she feared that if he touched it, he would bleed too. But what she didn't know was that from the library window overlooking the side path, Nathan had seen her stop and pick up the note. He hadn't heard the words she read, but the look in her eyes, the flicker of fear, the stiffness in her shoulders, the way she moved quickly into her room without looking back, hit him like a muted alarm. And he understood that whatever was unfolding between them, however gentle or beautiful, could not be separated from the wounds she carried. Everything he sensed in Grace, her caution, her quiet, her guarded stillness, was not who she was, but what had been done to her. And if someone was trying to resurrect those wounds, then he would be the first to stop it, by any means necessary. Grace sat on her bed long after the sunlight had shifted toward the back of the house. She did not know how much time had passed, only that each passing minute felt heavy as stone on her chest. The note lay hidden in the drawer like a cold whisper refusing to quiet. Her mind buzzed with unanswered questions, the old fear slithering back like a shadow crawling from the corner of the room. She should not have let herself feel at ease, should not have stepped into the light, should not have let Nathan see who she truly was, because when someone begins to care, that is when others begin to take that peace away. No one knew that truth better than she did. By late afternoon, she still finished her work, though her hands shook and her eyes kept darting behind her. Nathan called her into his study to organize some documents on the shelves. The air in the room felt thick the moment she stepped inside. He stood near the window with his back to her, holding a cup of coffee that had clearly grown cold, and she knew he had sensed something. She could feel his gaze following her since she left her room that morning. And even though he wasn't speaking, his silence weighed heavier than any question. "Grace," he said, his voice low but edged with steel. "What happened this morning?" She looked up, not pretending to be surprised. "Nothing, sir." "Don't do that," he said, turning toward her, his eyes cutting through the air like a blade. "I saw you find that note by the side door. I saw your face when you read it. You were afraid. I need to know why." She pressed her lips tightly together. She knew that once spoken, the truth could not be taken back. But silence this time was no longer a refuge. It had become a wall between her and the one person who had looked at her without judgment. "It's from someone from my past," she whispered. I think it's my ex. He found me." Nathan did not react at first, waiting for the rest. Grace drew a slow breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I lived with him for 3 years. In the beginning he was sweet, attentive. But then he started controlling everything: my phone, my friends, my work, even my thoughts. I wasn't allowed to wear makeup, wasn't allowed to go out without permission, wasn't allowed to look at men, even shop clerks. When I upset him, he went silent for days or exploded, breaking things, slamming doors, sometimes pushing me. But he never hit me. He said it never needed to go that far." The last sentence struck something deep in Nathan, and he stepped closer, his eyes blazing with a fire Grace had never seen. "What is his name?" he asked, his voice lower than before but burning with fury. She shook her head. "No, I'm not telling you so you can go after him. I just want you to know that if anything changes between us, it's not because you did something wrong. It's because I'm still learning how not to be afraid." Nathan's fist tightened, his jaw locked. "You think I can sit still knowing a man once made you live like a prisoner? You think I'll look away when someone left a threat under your door in this house?" She stepped back, not out of fear, but because he was trembling with anger, anger that did not belong to her, but to the man who had turned her into a shadow. "I escaped," she said softly. "I ran far. I don't need to be rescued. I just want to be left alone." "But he isn't leaving you alone," Nathan replied, his voice calmer now, yet unshakably firm. "And I can't pretend I don't know. You are not alone anymore, Grace. You are no longer the girl hiding in the dark. If he comes here, he won't just face your past. He'll face me." For the first time, Grace felt her chest tighten, not from fear, but from something tender and overwhelming. He had not promised to fix everything, had not offered grand words or easy assurances, but the steadiness in his voice carried the kind of protection that was quiet, yet rooted like something growing deep beneath the earth. She nodded softly, her eyes brimming though her voice stayed calm. "I trust you." And for the first time since realizing she was being watched, she no longer felt she had to run alone. Someone was standing in front of her, not to hold her back, but to keep the path ahead of her safe. The room settled into silence again after she spoke those words. "I trust you" was not a pledge of devotion or an invitation, nor was it a sign of weakness. It was a door opening, slowly but decisively, revealing a part of her no one had ever been allowed to see. Nathan remained where he was, his gaze fixed on her face as though memorizing every shift in her expression, every nod, every trembling curve of her lips. He did not ask anything else, nor did he step forward immediately, as if he understood that the space between them now held meaning of its own. But when she lifted her eyes, those eyes that had once looked at her as though the world had paused, glowed with something unexpectedly gentle. Not pity, but understanding and recognition. Grace moved toward him first, slow and careful, as though testing the shape of her own emotions. Nothing inside her felt certain anymore except one thing. She was not afraid of him. She was not afraid of the way he had stayed silent when she hurt, nor the way he looked directly at the softest, most unprotected part of her. When she stopped just a breath away from him, she spoke quietly. "I used to think I could never let anyone touch me again," she whispered, "because every touch came with a cost. But you're different. You never pushed. You only stood still and let me choose." Nathan lifted his hand, slowly, as if waiting for her to retreat at any moment. But she did not. Instead, when his fingers brushed her cheek, Grace closed her eyes and exhaled deeply. No fear rose up. No old memories screamed. There was only warmth, the steady rhythm of breath, and the quiet safety settling around her. He did not rush, did not claim her or hold her with any intent to possess. His hand simply rested there, gentle and unwavering, the same way he had been in her life present, constant, patient. Grace opened her eyes, and though they shimmered with tears, they held no trace of fragility, only emotion. "You can step back at any time," he murmured, his voice low and rough like a soft, sorrowful melody. She shook her head, her lips trembling before they relaxed. "I don't want to step back. Not with you." This time she lifted her own hand and placed it on his chest, right over the strong, steady heartbeat she could feel clearly beneath her palm. It surprised her how quickly her own heartbeat seemed to fall in sync with his. There was no music, no lights, no passionate declarations. Only two people, tired of hiding, finally touching one another in the most honest way they knew how. Nathan lowered his head, his lips brushing her forehead in the faintest of touches, carrying no desire, only a wordless promise that he was here, that she was safe, that everything she had endured did not diminish her in his eyes but made her brighter, stronger. Grace rested her head on his shoulder, her arms gently circling his back, and they stood there for a long time without speaking. In that moment, every crack inside her seemed to fill, not with words, but with presence. This was not an ordinary embrace. It was trust given freely. For the first time, she let someone cross the barrier she had built without regret. For the first time, he touched a woman not to possess, but to keep her from falling. And there, in that quiet room, they were no longer employer and maid, no longer two people from separate worlds. They were two souls healing each other, silently, tenderly, irreversibly. That day, the sunlight was soft, drifting through the window panes and scattering warm golden streaks across the old stone floor. The Callahan estate felt unusually still, as though the whole space was holding its breath for something private and delicate. Grace stepped into the back garden with a small basket, intending to gather fresh lavender to replace the flowers in the dining room. But she had barely taken a few steps when she saw Nathan standing beside the long wooden table nestled between the antique rose bushes. He wasn't wearing his usual suit, only a charcoal sweater and simple trousers, his hair tousled by the wind, and a gentle smile on his face, unlike any expression she had ever seen. On the table, resting neatly in an ivory velvet box, was a small gift. Grace paused, surprise mixing with a cautious warmth, but Nathan's eyes invited her forward with a wordless gentleness. "I asked you out here because I wanted to give this to you myself," he said, pulling out the chair beside him so she could sit. When she set the basket at her feet and sat across from him, he opened the velvet box, revealing a delicate necklace. The pendant was a single pearl, small and elegant, framed in a slim silver setting like a hand-drawn line. Not extravagant, not sparkling, yet instantly catching in its quiet beauty. "I don't know much about jewelry," Nathan said with a soft laugh, "but when I saw this, I thought of you." Not loud, not trying to stand out, but impossible to look away from once seen. Grace didn't touch it right away. She looked at the necklace, then at him, as though needing to confirm this moment was real. "Why today?" she asked softly, and Nathan did not look away. "Because yesterday you let me touch your fear," he said. "You didn't step back. You showed me something true, something vulnerable you've hidden for so long, and today, I want to give you something in return." He lifted the necklace from the box and stood, moving behind her. "May I?" he asked, and when she nodded, her heartbeat rising in her throat, he slipped the chain around her neck, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck and sending a shiver through her not from cold, but from feeling. The tiny clasp clicked softly, a sound like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. When Nathan returned to her side, he saw her fingers curled gently around the pendant, her eyes glistening. "No one has ever given me jewelry," she whispered. "Before, everything I ever received was a way to control me: phones, clothes, even my wallet. But this isn't like that." Nathan sat down and placed his hand over hers, giving a gentle squeeze. "It isn't meant to hold you," he said slowly. "It's so that whenever you feel yourself fading, you'll remember there was someone who saw you, fully and truly." Grace lowered her head, the tears falling freely now, yet she felt no shame. There was nothing weak in this. It was the release that comes after years of carrying a quiet weight. She held the pendant again, then looked up at him, her lips trembling but her eyes bright like a lake after rain. "Thank you for not seeing me as something broken, but as someone who can begin again." Nathan brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture so tender she felt as though she might be dreaming. "You don't have to begin again," he murmured. "You were never gone. You were just waiting for someone patient enough to look closely." They sat together beneath the soft afternoon light drifting down like a floating silk veil, and in that moment there was no master and no woman defined by past wounds. Only two people, and a necklace carrying a quiet promise that from this day forward, Grace would never again be invisible in her own life. The late afternoon light had softened by the time they were still sitting together in the back garden, where lavender stretched like a gentle carpet of pale purple, and the climbing heirloom roses draped themselves over the wooden trellis, releasing a faint fragrance into the breeze. Grace continued to turn the pendant lightly between her fingers as though memorizing every small curve of it, as though anchoring the quiet, profound shift that had just taken place between them. Nathan remained silent beside her, his gaze no longer carrying the flicker of surprise it once held, but instead a steady, understanding warmth, something sure and grounded. He did not push her, did not pull her closer, yet his presence made Grace feel she no longer stood alone in the quiet room of her heart. She no longer had to brace herself to be strong, nor hide the fragile parts she had buried under years of invisibility. The light seemed sifted at that moment, no longer harsh, only a soft golden glow that wrapped around everything like an embrace offered by the earth itself. Grace turned toward him, her hair catching in a small breeze, her eyes reflecting an emotion even she had no name for. "I never thought someone could make me feel safe just by being silent beside me," she said softly, almost like a confession. Nathan tilted his head, his eyes growing calm and lake-like before a quiet smile touched his lips, unforced and genuine enough to make her heart tighten. "I never thought," he said gently, "that someone who once tried so hard to keep her distance could make me want to come closer the way you do." His words were not the polished sweetness of a man practiced in affection. They were simple truth. And because they were truth, they made her heartbeat quicken. She felt warmth rising to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but because something delicate inside her had finally been touched. It was not a sudden spark, not a loud revelation, but the gathering of every quiet moment, every light touch, every unspoken glance in the days that had passed. As the sunlight slipped away from the edge of the wooden table and the dim blur of dusk settled over the garden, Nathan lifted his hand, this time without asking, and touched her cheek as though it had always belonged there. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering closed as if letting her emotions lead her. Then, for the first time, their lips met. Not fiercely, not urgently, just a soft, hesitant kiss, as though they feared shattering something sacred blooming between two souls lined with old cracks. The kiss carried the tenderness of newfound trust and the warmth of two people relearning how to love after years of exhaustion. Nathan's hand tightened slightly on her shoulder, while Grace placed her hand on his chest, where his heart beat wildly as if trying to carve this moment permanently into memory. The scent of her hair mingled with the fragrance of the garden roses and the familiar woodiness on his skin, forming a private world where only the two of them existed. When they parted, still holding each other's gaze, Grace exhaled softly, her lips trembling with the lingering sweetness. "I always thought my first kiss after everything I've lived through would be something I'd fear, or worse, something I'd have to endure," she whispered. But it wasn't like that. It felt like coming back to myself, a version of me I thought I had lost. Nathan rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closing as if holding her in an embrace that needed no arms. "Because you were never lost," he murmured. "You just needed someone patient enough to see you fully." Under the last light of the day, in a garden witnessed only by the sky and the faint perfume of flowers, They found each other not through a kiss, but through everything built slowly from trust, understanding, and quiet truth. And in that very moment, with that first kiss, Grace knew she would never return to being unseen. She had been seen wholly, and more than that, she had been loved. The morning after their first kiss, Nathan woke earlier than usual. He did not wake Grace, only watched her sleep in the pale sunlight spilling through the beige curtains. Her face looked softer, like a flower freshly watered, peaceful enough to make his own heart settle with emotion. Yet, at the same time, something else grew inside him, a rising unease. The unease seeded the day she received the threatening note, the fear she had tried to hide in her eyes, the story of the man who once controlled her and forced her into silence for so many years. And Nathan knew with unnerving clarity that peace could not survive if danger still lurked somewhere in the shadows. He stepped out of the room quietly and took the back staircase so as not to wake her. His phone had been vibrating in his pocket since early morning, and when he finally checked it, he found 3 messages from Mason, the head of internal security. Nathan had assigned him the task 3 days earlier, right after he first saw the note left beneath Grace's door. Unusual activity detected on the Southside cameras. The first message read, "Confirmed. Someone approached the fence on the night Grace went to the nightclub," the second said. And the final one, "Suspect identified through facial recognition, awaiting confirmation." Nathan's heartbeat quickened, not from surprise, but from the anger rising steadily within him. He was not only furious that someone had dared trespass on his territory, but because Grace, the woman he was slowly learning to love, had lived with fear far longer than she should have. Mason was already waiting in the surveillance room in the basement. The large screens flickered with footage pulled from the cameras around the estate. Nathan folded his arms, his eyes locked on each frame. In the view from the garden's back angle, a shadowy figure appeared near 3 o'clock in the morning, moving slowly along the fence before slipping out of sight. Though the face wasn't clear, the hunched posture and the way the man occasionally lifted his head to stare directly into the camera, unafraid, made it clear he was no ordinary trespasser. He knew Grace was here, and he wanted her to know he was watching. Mason enlarged a still image taken from the front gate camera, where the suspect showed himself for no more than a few seconds before disappearing into the dark. The quality wasn't perfect, but after 2 days of scanning databases, the system produced a match. Nathan read the name on the screen, his jaw tightening. Liam Price, 36 years old. Prior charges for assault, stalking, coercion. Previously reported by Grace 2 years ago, though the case had been dismissed for lack of evidence. He had dropped out of sight after that, moving across cities 3 times, changing his name once, and now had resurfaced like a starving wolf tracing the scent of old blood. Nathan could no longer sit still. "Track his every move, Mason," he ordered, his voice low but firm. "Double security around the estate, and don't let Grace know about any of this. Not yet." He would not let her sink back into that constant dread, not when she had only just begun to breathe again. Grace needed light, and he would shield her from the dark at any cost. On his way back, Nathan paused in the garden, the same place they had sat yesterday, the place where she had allowed him to kiss her and touch her heart for the first time. Looking at the lavender pots and the dewdrops still clinging to the leaves, he felt the stark contrast between the peace around him and the storm brewing within. It wasn't only anger, it was a promise. That whatever happened, whatever Liam attempted, Nathan would not let Grace be wounded again by the life she had escaped. She was no longer a woman running from shadows. She was a woman loved, protected, and standing on her own feet. And he would make sure nothing stole that from her, no matter what it required. Liam Price appeared on Monday morning when the sun had not yet risen fully beyond the trees behind the estate. He did not sneak in like a thief, but walked straight to the side gate near the greenhouse, as if he had the right to be there, as if the past he had scattered behind him no longer held any consequence. What he did not know was that Nathan had been waiting. Not with rage, not with fists, not with the gun he kept in his office drawer, but with a silence prepared as precisely as a trap that needed no rope. The cameras had followed Liam from the moment he left the cheap motel outside the city. Mason's team checked every vehicle he used, traced his calls, even noted the items he bought at the nearby pharmacy. Everything was already in Nathan's hands, but what he wanted was not revenge. He wanted an ending. Nathan stepped out from the back veranda, his leather shoes brushing over the damp ground, the early sun scattering through the trees in broken shafts of light. He stopped only a few steps away from Liam. No guards, no witnesses, just one man facing a shadow not entirely his own. Liam looked slightly surprised to see Nathan alone. He smirked, still carrying that old confidence that had kept Grace silent for 3 long years. "I came to talk," Liam said first, his voice tinged with arrogance. "I'm not here for trouble. I just want to know if she's doing okay." Nathan did not answer. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his gaze unwavering. "You already know she's okay," he said slowly, each word measured. "And that won't change. But your presence needs to. Immediately." Liam scoffed. "I haven't done anything wrong. I can go wherever I want." Nathan nodded slightly. "You can go anywhere you wish, except here. And I'm not saying that as the man who owns this estate. I'm saying it as the man she has chosen to stand beside her." The calmness in his voice pushed something sharp through Liam's composure. "She used to be mine," he snapped. "She owes me an explanation." That was when Nathan stepped forward, close enough for Liam to see that the coldness in his eyes needed no violence behind it. "No one owes you anything," Nathan said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a man who never needed to prove strength. "Grace belongs to no one. She survived you. That is her answer." From a distance, Mason stepped forward with a thick folder in hand. Nathan glanced at him, then continued speaking. "I have evidence you trespassed onto this property," he said. "I have video, timestamps, witnesses, but I am not handing you to the police. Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because Grace does not need more darkness pulled into her life. She needs freedom, and that freedom begins with you disappearing." Liam raised an eyebrow and let out a mocking laugh, though unease had begun to creep into his eyes as Mason handed the folder to Nathan. Nathan didn't open it. He simply set it on the stone table beside him and pulled out a single photograph, a still frame of Liam standing outside Grace's door at 3 in the morning. "If you don't leave this city within 3 days," Nathan said, "this file goes straight to the authorities. And if you think you can come back, remember this. I don't need violence to end things, but I will not hesitate to do what's right." Liam said nothing more. He looked at Nathan, then at Mason, then turned and walked away. Not quickly, but without the defiant swagger he once carried. When his figure finally disappeared behind the trees, Nathan remained still. He knew this was not the final chapter, but it was a necessary full stop. Not one delivered with fists or with power, but with a resolve born from the respect he carried for the woman he loved. He didn't need to strike to prove himself. He only needed to ensure Grace never lowered her head again because of her past. And in doing so, he protected her not only from that man, but from the wounds that had once made her forget her own worth. Grace stood at the large hallway window on the 2nd floor, the one overlooking the garden where she and Nathan had sat together on that quiet afternoon. Morning light poured in softly, dusting the sheer curtains with a pale, golden glow like scattered sunlight. She didn't know how the confrontation between Nathan and Liam had unfolded, only that ever since then something inside her had shifted. No more restless nights startled awake by a noise at the door. No more flinching whenever someone knocked on the iron gate. No more feeling as though she lived temporarily in a refuge that might collapse at any moment. One morning afterward, Mason stopped by the garden, leaving her a thin, neatly wrapped folder. He didn't say much, only smiled and told her Nathan wanted her to be the first to know everything had been handled. Grace lifted the folder, her hands trembling faintly though her eyes had brightened. Inside were photos, documents, proof that Liam had left the city, confirmation that no one was following her, no eyes lurking in the shadows, no breath at her shoulder each time she thought she was safe. She folded the folder, held it to her chest like a certificate of freedom she never believed would belong to her. For the first time in many years, she felt she didn't have to run. She no longer had to hide behind her uniform, no longer needed to choose a cafe seat near the door, no longer needed to turn her head every few minutes to make sure no one followed her. Something inside her loosened layer by layer, piece by piece, until only her true self remained, without fear, without hesitation, without concealment. That afternoon, she stepped into the garden where Nathan was trimming the rose bushes. He looked up when he saw her, a small smile touching the corner of his mouth, as though he had been waiting for this moment. She said nothing, only approached and handed him the neatly bound folder. Nathan looked at it, then at her. "You read it?" he asked. She nodded. "And I believe." 3 simple words, yet they tightened something in his chest. "Believe what?" he asked softly, setting the shears on the wooden bench beside him. "Believe that I don't have to live like a shadow anymore," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "And that if someone ever comes back, I won't be alone." Nathan stepped closer, the afternoon light stretching their shadows across the stone path. He brushed a strand of hair from her face and cupped her cheek in his hand. "Not alone," he repeated, a quiet vow. Grace rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath the thin fabric. She didn't know where the future would take them or what trials lay ahead. But she knew she was standing firm now, not because someone held her up, but because someone walked beside her, not leading, not imposing, simply holding her hand. And that was enough for her to lift her head for the first time in years. Grace walked around the estate without glancing over her shoulder. She visited the bookstore, the familiar cafe, even began rewriting the old resume she had once hidden away. She began drawing again, this time with the true colors of herself. Not the colors of her past, but of her present, a place where there was a man who never tried to change her, only chose to see her until she could finally see herself. And for Grace, that was not simply protection. It was a kind of rebirth. That afternoon, Nathan sat in his study, the last light of day drifting through the glass windows and making the dust in the air shimmer like gold. He was rereading a report, though the words refused to settle in his mind. All he could think about was Grace, the peaceful curve of her smile that morning as she walked into the kitchen wearing a soft cream-colored dress instead of her usual uniform. She was no longer the housemaid standing by the tea counter, no longer the quiet figure passing through his life in silence. She was changing, becoming herself in a way no one had ever allowed. And he knew it was time to say aloud what he had held inside for so long, that between them, every old boundary needed to be set aside, starting with the role she had never truly belonged to. When Grace knocked on the door with a cup of mint tea in her hands, Nathan looked up and smiled. But this time, instead of setting the cup down and leaving, she lingered, standing before his desk. "You asked for me?" she said, her voice soft as a leaf touching water. Nathan nodded and gestured for her to sit across from him. She hesitated for just a heartbeat, then sat, her fingers interlaced in her lap. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. Slowly, without detours. "Grace, I think we need to have a serious conversation. About your role here." She stilled slightly, her lashes lowering for a moment. You mean, the job? Nathan nodded and leaned forward, his voice low but filled with sincerity. You've been here more than half a year. Always responsible, discreet, reliable. But what I'm about to say has nothing to do with job performance. It has to do with you. And with me. Grace said nothing, only tightened her fingers together. Nathan continued. I can't let you stand in the role of a housemaid any longer, because every time you put on that uniform, every time you walk down the hallway on those quiet, careful steps as if you don't want anyone to notice you, I feel as though I'm anchoring you to a past you're trying so hard to step out of. She lifted her head slightly, her gaze meeting his, shimmering with emotions that had not yet found their names. Nathan stood, walked around the desk, and sat on its edge beside her. I know you're not ready for everything, and I'm not asking for anything. I just want you to live as the person you're becoming. You don't need to clean this house to justify your presence here. You don't need to serve dinner to feel you have a place. You are here because I want you here. As yourself. Grace looked at him, hesitant. But if I'm not working here, what am I in this house? Nathan leaned down, his hand brushing gently over hers. You are the person I want to wake up with every morning, the person I think of first when I walk out that door, the person who makes me believe I can be better than I've been. You don't need a defined role to exist in my life. You only need to be you. She pressed her lips together, tears rising without shame as they slipped free. I'm afraid, if I'm not the maid anymore, I won't know where I belong, she whispered. I'm used to being on the edges. Nathan shook his head gently, leaning close to murmur near her ear. You were never on the edges, Grace. I was simply too blind to realize you've always been at the center. She laughed through her tears, a soft, embarrassed, relieved sound. He took her hand and placed it over his chest. From today on, you are no longer the employee in this house. You are someone who is welcomed here, not out of obligation, but out of affection. If you want to stay, you can stay without any title at all. You only need to be Grace, the woman I'm choosing, every single day. In the quiet that followed, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The change had already begun, not through declarations but through the way Nathan looked at her no longer as the woman who once moved silently through cold stone halls, but as someone stepping fully into the light, loved for nothing but her honest presence. And for Grace, for the first time in many years, she understood she didn't have to earn her place. She only had to remain. And this time, not to hide, but to live. Truly live. The nightclub was no longer pulsing with the wild music of the night he first saw her in that blazing red dress, surrounded by the feverish motion of strangers under flashing lights. Today it was quiet, almost reverent. No strobe lights, no swaying bodies. Only a warm, golden glow spilling across the empty dance floor as though the space had been waiting for the two of them to return and finish something left incomplete. Nathan parked at the entrance, came around to open her door. Grace stepped out, her long, wine-colored dress trailing softly, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, unstyled but glowing with the gentle beauty of a woman who had learned to love herself. She looked up at the sign still glowing above the entrance, her expression touched with a strange, tender wonder, as though she were seeing a past self she no longer recognized. Do you remember that night? She asked quietly as they walked inside, her heels tapping lightly on the wooden floor. Nathan nodded, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. I remember every beat of the music, every movement you made. That was the first time I truly saw you. Soft music drifted from the hidden speakers, not the pounding electronic rhythm from before, but a classic jazz melody, saxophone warm and fluid, drums beating slowly like the breath of an autumn evening. Nathan led her to the center of the floor, where the light gathered in a soft circle around them. No one else was there. No witnesses, no noise, only the two of them and the space that once held a silent collision of their worlds, now chosen deliberately and without fear. Grace rested her hand on his shoulder, his arm settled gently around her waist, and they began to dance, slowly, each step woven from all the days behind them, from shy glances to the first touch, from the garden kiss to the moment she chose to stay, not for duty, but for love. She rested her head against his chest, letting the music guide them and letting the sound of his heartbeat become the rhythm that belonged only to the two of them. There was no hurry, no need for words, only the gentle movement of two people who had once been lonely, once broken, once retreated from the world, now finding their way back to each other in the very place where everything began. Nathan lowered his head to whisper into her hair, his voice low and warm like breath, brushing softly along her neck. I used to think I had everything, but the truth is I had nothing at all until you stepped out of the shadows and made me want to see the world through different eyes. Grace looked up at him, her eyes shimmering, though no longer with fear or hurt. It was the gaze of a woman who knew she deserved to be loved and kept, not as something precious to be hidden, but as a companion with a worth entirely her own. I used to think I belonged only on the edges, she murmured, a faint outline in someone else's world. But you made me believe I don't have to be dim to stay safe anymore. The music drifted into its final notes, and they kept turning slowly in the dim light, as though the outside world had vanished. That moment, that floor, was no longer a stage demanding attention, but a sacred space where two souls touched for the second time only now, with hearts completely open. When the music stopped, Nathan didn't let go, and Grace didn't step back. They stood there in a beautiful silence, as though every feeling had already been spoken through the way they had moved together. And in that quiet, the only thing still echoing was the gentle harmony they had always hoped for, but never dared to believe could be real. This was no longer the unexpected dance in the midst of chaos, but a quiet confirmation that, after everything, they had found each other again. No hiding, no fear, only two people choosing one another despite all the reasons life had once given them to turn away. As they stepped off the dance floor, the streetlights had already cast their soft gold across the pavement outside, yet the world inside Nathan still felt bathed in the tender glow of the music that had just ended. He opened the car door for Grace with a kind of careful reverence, as though every gesture now had to honor the depth of what they had just shared. On the drive home, they said very little, but the silence wasn't awkward. It was warm and steady, like the quiet space between two steady heartbeats. When the car turned onto the tree-lined road leading back to the estate, Nathan suddenly stopped at a bend where the moonlight shimmered on the surface of the small lake behind the white wooden fence. He turned off the engine, staring ahead for a long moment before turning to her, his eyes reflecting the moon, deep and luminous enough that she felt as though she were being seen by the safest part of him. I used to think loving someone was like a negotiation, he began, his voice slow and steady like background music barely humming through the night, a calculation between gain and loss. But then you appeared, quiet, unassuming. You were simply there every day, gentle as morning light, steady as breath, and I realized I had fallen in love with you through the smallest things. Grace didn't answer right away. She looked at him, her lips parting as though to speak, then closing again, letting him finish. I love the way you make tea, the way you walk as if afraid to wake the whole house, the way you close your eyes when you listen to music, and the way you smile without needing a reason. But more than anything, I love the way you exist brave, soft, and honest enough to make me want to become a better man, just to deserve to stand beside you. He turned fully toward her, taking her hand and pressing it over his heart. I don't just want to protect you anymore, Grace. I want to live with you, not as someone rescuing you, not as someone shielding you, but as the man who loves you, who chooses you, who wants to wake every morning knowing you're still there. Grace looked into those eyes that had once frightened her with their coldness, now holding all the tenderness she never thought she deserved. She drew in a slow breath, her heart racing not from fear but because, for the first time, she knew she was about to say something she once believed she would never dare to speak. I used to believe no one could truly see me, she said softly, because I learned to live in the corner where no one asked or expected anything. I thought that if I stayed quiet enough, worked hard enough, no one would have a reason to hurt me again. But then you came. You didn't ask much. You didn't push. You simply stayed patient and sincere. And little by little, you made me believe I could be loved without disappearing. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from sadness but from release. Nathan brushed them away with his thumb as if they were delicate crystals. I love you, Nathan, she whispered. Not because you're strong or because you helped me escape my past, but because you saw me before I could see myself. And if you still want this, if it still lives in your heart, then I choose you too. Not as a place to hide, but as a place to begin again. Nathan smiled, a smile that softened his entire face like a warm summer night's breeze. He leaned forward, kissed her forehead gently, and whispered, "We choose each other, and that is the truest thing I have ever known." In the quiet of the night, with only the soft rustle of the trees and the moon shimmering on the lake, they sat hand in hand, needing no grand promises, no distant vows, only this moment full, clear, and honest. Morning light filtered softly through the thin white curtain, laying a pale honey-colored sheen across the room, like someone had brushed liquid gold over the pillows. Grace blinked in that half-dreaming, half-waking haze, feeling the warmth of the body beside her holding her as though offering a wordless whisper in sleep. She did not startle, did not jolt upright the way she so often had when waking in an unfamiliar place, did not rush to piece together her surroundings. Because the steady rise and fall of Nathan's chest and the unconscious way his arm curled around her waist were all she needed to know she was exactly where she was meant to be. She turned slightly, careful not to wake him, her gaze resting on the familiar face she once believed would always remain beyond reach. In the early light, the features that could look sharp and stern became almost tender, softened into a peace she had never imagined he possessed. He had never been someone who slept deeply, yet beside her, even his body seemed to understand how to let go. There was something instinctive in the way they lay together, not the fire of passion, but the quiet stillness that only forms when two souls finally find a place to rest. Grace burrowed closer, her cheek brushing his chest, her fingers grazing the silver necklace she still wore, the gift he had given her, as a first acknowledgement of truly being seen. Everything inside her calmed, settling like the surface of a lake after rain. She no longer thought of the past or worried that she might wake to find this peace dissolved like a dream. Dreams did not have the scent of a real man, the weight of real arms, or the steady heartbeat aligning with her own. And Nathan, the man who once made the world feel dangerous, had become the very reason it now felt safe. He stirred slightly, his breath shifting, as if sensing her gaze. A moment later, his gray eyes opened, hazy and gentle, catching her in that space between sleep and waking. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep yet warm enough to wrap around her. Grace smiled, brushing her fingertips along his cheek. "Good morning," she whispered, resting her forehead lightly against his. They stayed like that, letting the morning light wash over the corners of what once stood between them. No distance, no former roles, no titles imposed by circumstance, only a woman waking in the arms of the man she loved, knowing she no longer had to run from anything inside herself. Nathan pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "I could wake up like this every day," he said quietly. She laughed, a sound so true it made his heart loosen. "So could I, as long as I have you, and light like this." Outside, birds chattered, wind brushed gently through the trees. A new day began not with an alarm, not with worry, not with the hum of fear, only with a quiet morning in which two people, once hurt, were learning to heal each other through the simplest things. And in that moment, Grace knew one truth. She was no longer the woman standing in the shadows looking toward the light. She was living inside it. And Nathan was the gentle son she had never dared to wish for. Grace stood by the living room window, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, watching Nathan trim the rose bushes in the back garden. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, every movement slow and deliberate as though even the flowers deserved tenderness. Morning sunlight slid across his hair, making his presence almost unreal in its calm. But this was not a dream. This was her reality. A reality earned through fear, loss, trembling nights, and moments when she thought she would never reach safety. Nathan looked up, catching her gaze through the glass. He smiled and lifted a hand in greeting, as though the simple fact of her watching was enough to complete his day. Grace stepped outside, her bare feet touching the dewy ground. When she reached him, he put down the clippers and gently took her hand, guiding her to sit beside him on the stone bench. They sat for a long time without speaking. Everything that needed saying had already been spoken through their glances, their touch, and the quiet they both understood. Then Nathan turned to her, his eyes more earnest than she had ever seen. He touched the silver chain at her neck, the gift he had once offered as proof he had finally seen her truly seen her. His voice was low and deliberate, each word seeming to settle into the cool, tender air of the morning. "You know, Grace, you're not invisible anymore." She didn't answer immediately. She only tightened her fingers around his, as if responding that she understood. Because to her, those words were not only a truth, they were a miracle. She had once believed she would always move quietly through life, unnamed, unnoticed, unneeded. But she now knew that when you dare to step out of hiding, when you trust the light enough to open your heart, the world begins to see you differently. The story of Grace and Nathan was not simply a love story. It was the journey of a woman walking from darkness into light, from surviving to truly living, from shrinking herself to standing in her full presence. And it was the journey of a man learning to wield his strength, not to control, but to protect, not to shield his emotions, but to offer them honestly. In life, many of us have felt small, unworthy, or unseen. Many have believed that love is something meant for others, not for us. But this story is a reminder that every person deserves love, deserves recognition, and deserves the chance to live as the truest version of themselves. If you have listened all the way to this moment, we hope that the story of Grace and Nathan has touched a quiet, hidden place inside your heart. Tell us where you are watching this video from and what part of your own life this story brings to mind. Have you ever felt invisible? And who was the first person who made you feel seen, heard, and valued? We would love for you to share your thoughts in the comments below. And please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video so that these meaningful stories can reach even more people. We are always grateful to hear your honest reflections because every word you share becomes a heartbeat that keeps each story alive. Thank you for spending your time with us until the very end. We wish you and your loved ones good health, peaceful days, and a life filled with quiet joy. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video. where we will continue to explore stories full of emotion and deep human tenderness.